This is the third class in the RPH 140 World Philosophies, recently upgraded to Practical Wisdom, Phronesis in Our Time. How the ancient love of wisdom is still relevant in our society at this time. So, last time I talked about Athens and analogies between the US and Athens, or I suggested that you think about it. So I talked about their great democracy and what they had and how they got it corrupted. And the next thing I often point out to students is just a part of a reading that will come later. And it's called The Myth of Normal. And the writer is Gabor Mate, a doctor, trained doctor, but he specializes in trauma. And his claim is, this is just a few quotes because I ended with the corruption of Athens. And so he's saying in his work with people's physical and mental health, that chronic illness, mental and physical, is a function or a feature of our culture, not a glitch. The culture itself makes people sick, physically and mentally sick. And a lot of people make money on making us physically and mentally sick. So he says we have a toxic culture. The entire context of social structures, belief systems, assumptions, and values that surround us and necessarily pervade every aspect of our lives, the total commercial environment that circumscribes an entire mental world. And so our mental world has been sort of hijacked by this drive for money. We've become accustomed or acculturated to so much of what plagues us. It has become normal. Much, and again, much of what passes for normal in our society is neither healthy nor natural. To meet modern society's criteria for normality is in many ways to conform to requirements that are profoundly abnormal in regard to our nature-given needs, which is to say unhealthy and harmful on the physiological, mental, and even spiritual levels. Illness is an expected and therefore normal consequences of abnormal, unnatural circumstances. And here's the last quote for right now. Our country's skewed idea of normality is the single biggest impediment to fostering a healthier world. So I link that to Plato's discussion of Athens because Plato shows that the democracy as it was founded and as it was intended had become so corrupt. And people thought it was normal, right? It was normal to seek money, pleasure, glory, and power. And the great thing about Athens was that you were free to do it. You had opportunity to seek your own personal self-interest, when the whole point of the culture was that you had the opportunity to become an engaged citizen and to think like a citizen and to go beyond your personal survival or self-interest so you could create a flourishing life and take great pride in the fact that you didn't create instability by seeking personal pleasure, money, destabilizing your society and leading to an authoritarian leader. So, so, so my point to my students is that we are becoming less stable. We have been. The first time ever, I think last year, we were listed as a faltering democracy. This has never, I don't think it's ever been true because they started the list not so long ago. And it's a shock to people around the world, but my students really need to be aware of this because they have been acculturated. They do assume that we have a democracy and it's great and all of that. And they don't know how slowly and surely and unconsciously they have been conditioned into this very toxic culture. And so I'm going to go back again. And I do keep going back to this because the lecture for today is about is about what I said last time about the fourth industrial revolution, a transition to a digital and green economic and cultural system. So it also has to be a cultural system, a set of values. Now, we have this disruption, digital, technological, environmental, geopolitical, and demographic. And the next, the reading for today is specifically taken from that book, Jeffrey Sachs' book, The Ages of Globalization. So here's a summary of the reading that I assigned for the students. The 7 ages were Paleolithic, Neolithic, Equestrian, Classical, Ocean, Industrial, and now digital. So you can, fairly tell pretty easily. The classical was the Greeks. The ocean was when colonialism, the ships went out to the rest of the world. Industrial was the move from agricultural to industrial. And now we have digital. So his book is about the complexities of globalization. So it's important that my students, my main takeaway for my students is that it's real. They're going to live through it. It's happening now, but especially by the time they take on leadership positions, they will be required to lead in a world that is going through this transition much more than it is now. So they will take the lead in about 20 years. And by then, we definitely should be very much into green energy. The climate is going to change, and I have every reason to think it's going to change quickly because we're going to reach some tipping points that we've been warned about for a long time. So the final takeaway for my students is not to find someone to blame and not to be surprised and not to be scared and not to overreact. And they should just know it's complicated. Anybody who tries to oversimplify it is wrong, and they're not going to come up with good decisions. So if practical wisdom is constantly making the right decision in a situation and doing what's best, then what my students need to know is that they will get presented with the kinds of decisions that they, hopefully because of this class, but without this class, might never have been able to anticipate. So I'm asking them to anticipate decisions related to all these disruptions. There are ways to improve. Every time there's a disruption, there's good and there's bad. And so we have to try to choose the good, and we're much more likely to if we anticipate that these things will happen. The book went to press when COVID hit, and that's another problem related to globalization. So Adam Smith, even long ago, he knew that the voyages of Westerners around the world, that was the ocean age, would have profound consequences, good and bad, including both the explosion of commerce as well as massive repression of native societies by European conquerors and colonializers. It's ironic that Adam Smith's work is used to justify colonialism. Also, Adam Smith was not as rabid a free market proponent as people who claim he is, use his name to justify no taxes and letting the markets make all sorts of decisions. Adam Smith wanted public education. He thought it was really important so people can tell a good ruler from a bad one. He also wanted very much for people to be educated, the privileged class to be educated in generosity, to want to be generous and to want a middle class. Otherwise, money would stick to money. Okay, so what happened? Actually, Westerners brought diseases to native populations around the world. These were devastating. I mean, there was all the killing with guns and violence, but the worst was these diseases that the natives had not been exposed to, and so it was devastating for them. So today, there's going to be another pandemic, at least in my students' lives, probably more than one. So on the one hand, we can find the causes and the cures. On the other hand, we keep relating to each other in these complex ways that are going to lead to more and more of them. So it's a matter of playing catch up. This is true in a lot of research I've noticed. That we pay a lot of money to chemists, for example, who are finding an alternative to fluorocarbons because we found out they didn't work. So over and over again, we have a problem that we caused because we had this unnatural intervention. And then it created another problem. And so we put a ton of money to try and solve that problem. And then that creates another problem. So there's that issue. Then I have another friend that works on vaccines for tuberculosis. And so the one we have now, there are resistant strains of TB. And so it's coming back. So now her lab, she's part of chemists who work on creating another one. And then, so you're just sort of chasing it down. Sometimes a new variant comes out before the research, before the new vaccine has actually been approved. And so they have to start over again. So there's that sort of chasing down, trying to keep up with the resilience, the built-in ability of natural creatures to adapt and form variants. Then there's other research that is tied to possibly curing cancer. Well, the problem, I listened to a biologist, a cell biologist, talking about this the other day, that one of the causes of cancer is that this one chemical, whatever it is, starts being created in a lot of it suddenly starts being created, and his discoveries might be able to inhibit that. Well, okay, but what about why does that happen? Is there any reason? Is that common from before? Have we always had this kind of cancer, or is there something in the environment that has caused this, whatever it is, chemical to start producing suddenly, which eventually leads to cancer? So I always get the impression that this stuff is occurring within a context where we are creating an environment based on unnatural, like Mr. Gabor says about we live in this unnatural environment. Another example is plastics. Their research is conclusive that plastics leach endocrine disruptors. And so most of us are healthy enough that it doesn't disrupt our own endocrine systems. But if somebody's been under a lot of stress, they can get endocrine cancer. And we know how they got it. Plastic. Are we going to get rid of plastic? No. I mean, it would cost, think of how much money all these corporations would lose. So that had, many, many examples of where just a physically toxic environment is making us sick. And so then there's also the fact that we interact so much. There's diseases will be spread, and we don't ever stop interacting, but we have to anticipate it and also don't have all the misunderstandings that we had last time with COVID. People still they interpret what the cause was, what the best solution was. Just it's uncanny to me that there are still all these disagreements. The only one thing I would say is that I think it was a mistake when in the US the bars and restaurants opened before the schools opened, right? The schools, kids needed to be in school. And so there needed to be an effort to make sure that adults would wear masks at home or whatever they needed to do so the kids could come to school. But we didn't do that. We didn't prioritize children and their education. Okay, so it's important to understand the threats from globalization and to face them, not by ending globalization, but by using the means of international cooperation to control the negative consequences. So at the moment, Mr. Trump, we just elected him a second time. He is trying to, at least he says he's trying to step back on globalization, to have more tariffs, more nativism, more America first. I don't know if it's actually going to happen. But I mean, I think we definitely need to create these institutions of international cooperation. So we need the United Nations. We need it to be better than it is. And it would be better if nations actually participated. And also they sent experts to advise those international organizations. You could even have a different one than the UN, but some international health organization, some organization to have a lot of specialists in pandemics so that they can work together the next time one hits. Disease control is not the only area where global cooperation is vital. There are many other concerns, especially climate change, right? It has to be a global issue. It needs to be international. And then biodiversity is really important. And then pollution of the air, soil, and ocean. This, again, has got to be directly or indirectly connected to cancer. Proper use of governance of the internet, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, avoiding mass forced migration, and the ever-present challenge of avoiding or ending violent conflicts. Okay, so this is what needs to be done. At this moment in time, we have many conflicts in Europe, Ukraine and Russia, in Israel, the Mideast and Israel, and in the rising animosity between the US and China. And we really need to step back and not overreact and be aware of the horrible, horrible consequences if we do overreact. All right. So just some highlights from his discussion of the previous eras. During the classical age, ideas mattered enormously in the rise of the empires. The major empires were spurred by new religious and philosophical outlooks, such as the new philosophies of the Greco-Roman world that profoundly shaped the outlooks of those societies. All right, and I'm also in my classes showing how Aristotle's virtues and Plato's description of Athens can also still be relevant today. They have to be adapted, of course, expanded, but still the ideas are still important. Then the industrial age gave rise to the first global hegemon, Great Britain. That one country could dominate the world, and later the US. These two powers bestrode the entire globe with unprecedented military, technological, and financial power. But as the end of the British Empire demonstrated, even hegemons can quickly lose their place at the apex of the global competition. So his position is that we're going through a geopolitical change. We're moving from an era of a hegemonic power to a multipolar world. Especially Americans should not be afraid of that. They shouldn't try to resist it. They should just go with it, go with the flow. I mean, why? If we're democracy, why would we be obsessed with being number one? Like that happened to Athens. We're not, not being able to have an empire and thinking of ourselves as a democracy is perfectly inconsistent. So it would be more consistent with our value system that we want. Everybody has this capacity to be fully human, and we want everybody in the world to have an opportunity to cultivate that. Well, if you have a multipolar world, then it's more likely that you actually will. Okay. All right. I have to plug in. Oh, I just said the most important thing. Yes. Dialogue. I never thought about politics before, but all of a sudden I know everything about everything in politics. So, well, it's kind of an influence. Politics is probably the most difficult thing to make judgments. Okay, all right. Hmm, so where'd that go? I thought there we go. There we go. All right, so all right, so we're moving to a multipolar world. Most economic and demographic change has occurred just in the last 200, 250 years, right? And we have a 300,000 years as a species. So it is really important to keep that in mind, as it has been a really rapid transition, and our bodies are biologically evolved, and we can't necessarily, our minds can't necessarily process all of this. So we really have to be careful how we use our phones and all this stuff because our brains can't keep up with this, and we can easily overreact or think we know what we don't know and all sorts of things. There's a basic idea in economics that a larger market leads to higher incomes and more rapid growth. With a larger market, there can be more specialization in job tasks, leading to greater skills and proficiency of the workforce, and a falling cost of production, which is exactly what's happening. One can therefore see the history of globalization as a series of scale enlarging transformations, which is true, right? Everything is at a huge scale right now. How many people have smartphones, right? Billions. How many people don't is the question. The sheer scale of human activity is dangerously, this is the problem, is that it's impinging on environmental processes. So Mr. Mate says that American society is at war with nature, but global society, globalization is also at war with environmental processes. So we've reached the scale where human activities are dangerously changing the climate, right? So we really need to make a transition to a green energy future. So what Mr. Sachs also wants is not, this is not just an engineering problem. We want a global, sustainable civilization. We want people to be civilized, to take pleasure in this, to create a culture that they're happy with, that incorporates all of their values into this green energy transition. All right, so the Malthus argued that following any rise in productivity, the world would end with more poor people with no long-term solution. Well, he was wrong, right? He couldn't anticipate the technology we have, their agricultural methods, etc. Also, as living standards have risen, women have fewer children. So we're at a replacement rate in most areas. But we can't show, we haven't learned how to avoid destroying the natural environment. So in the future, there might be diebacks. There might be billions of people who die because it's called overshoot. We arrogantly didn't think about it. We either thought nature is going to be fine, or I don't know what people are thinking of. It makes no sense. They're not, like, nobody's thinking of the big picture. That's why I want my students to think of the big picture. The gradual transformation to urban life. That was that fifth disruption, was from rural to urban. So in the past, the primary sector, which is related to food, minerals, and it was rural areas, mostly farms. And then the secondary is industrial, transforming commodities into marketable goods, and that was rural and urban. And then the third level, supporting those activities, and getting to living well. So it's like the distinction in Aristotle between basic biological living, coming together to live more efficiently, and then this whole level of the flourishing life, human well-being, education, health, leisure, governance, citizens taking turns governing, and then all the different educational and cultural networks needed so that people can actually be educated and exercise that capacity. Military, public administration, courts. Lots of social contracts, and most of those are in urban areas. So machines are substituting for manual labor. Most of the work in the future will be in this third level sector, and it will be urban. Today, a farmer can feed 70 families. So primary employment is 28%, secondary is 22%, and this is in general in the world. The third level service is 50%. But in the US, it's 2%, 13%, and 85%. And that's where we're headed, right? So there's an interplay. Oh, there's also geography, technological, and institutions. The geography will affect your role in the green energy future. So where it used to be the deserts, had no Well, first of all, deserts had nothing. Then the deserts in the Mideast had oil underneath them. And now the deserts are going to provide a major energy source because we'll have solar panels. I know in China, they have a desert that they not only do they put solar panels, but they have figured out how to capture droplets of fog, and with chickens um, hacking through the dirt, making it more porous, and their feces fertilizing the land, they're actually creating uh, pasture land for animals in between the solar panels. So there's just lots going on that's pretty exciting. So it's all going to be about technological innovations, and they also have to go with institutional innovations. So I'm excited about the green energy future because I've known about the need to be for environmental sustainability for 57 years. And it's just been driving me nuts that nothing gets done and our societies get more and more fossil fuel. That my students, they can't even put a aluminum can in a recycling bin that's 5 steps away from the garbage can. They're just so out of touch with nature and they're so unaware of our desperate need to go green and all the ways their own lives are going to be profoundly affected by climate change. The lack of education is just profound, and the lack of just being habituated as children to respect the natural world is just mind-blowing. But anyway, that's why I'm having my students read this book. Just you have to see the big picture. We will have to turn to a zero carbon energy by the end of the century, or we will destroy life on Earth, guaranteed. At one point, again, because up till 10 years from now, I just thought life on Earth would end and that would be it. But I don't think so. I think there will be diebacks, but I don't think human life will end, and I think there will be life. It will just be a lot less, and we'll have to just live in a different way, but not substantially different. I mean, the Chinese also have what's called vertical farming, where they grow healthy greens in a greenhouse with like 12 layers. They don't need dirt, and they use the greenhouse. They very little water. They don't need earth. So they are developing ways to grow healthy food. So the green energy transition is not going to be us eating chips or something. We can eat really healthy food that our biology, our bodies want us to, but it has to be grown in a different way. So there is a lot of innovation and it's exciting. In the past, groups have battled each other, which instills in our genes and the culture a capacity to cooperate within a group with a tendency toward conflict between groups. And we just have to train ourselves that we're all in this together, that the green energy transition should not create animosity. Innovations also bring improvements in military technology, and that changes political institutions. Eventually, both sides, everybody gets the technology. So in our case, cyber war is the big war. If you want to defend our country militarily, you should probably become a really good um, uh, engineer in cyber military technology, military warfare. Another thing you could do is security, cyber security, because you have to protect yourself against other people's military technology. So the rise of China, the rise of India, and the population of Africa are going to lead to a very different geopolitical balance. Nothing to be afraid of. Um, I think probably there will be an arms race between, or a military race between China and America, which is unfortunate. It's a complete waste. But hopefully nobody will use their weapons. But it could be really a high-tech situation. So looking back, can the world choose a path of shared prosperity, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability? This is the challenge of sustainable development. How should our global governance be organized now that we are in a multipolar world? So that's the challenge of multilateral governance. And is global peace possible? What model of human understanding and ethics could we have? The challenge of universal values. So again, for me, it's global, multilateral, sustainable, and civilization. People don't give up on their civilization. Not just, I mean, universal values, just a way of life that resonates with them. It's connected to their ancient traditions, but also connected to cutting edge green energy way of life. We will see several powerful trends. China, India, relative decline of the US, nothing to be afraid of, right? It's much better for us to adapt. Growth of Africa. So we just need to adapt, and that's how we will flourish if we learn how to compete with China for green products, get involved, and not keep. Right now, we're still committed to fossil fuels forever, and this is totally dysfunctional. It's causing us to fall behind, unfortunately. E.O. Wilson says we exist in a bizarre combination of Stone Age emotions, which is why I always bring us back to the Greeks, because their tragedies showed people given over to some real Stone Age emotions, some real brutality, and sort of trying to get that, you to flush that out of your system. Medieval institutions, which in the case of getting a PhD is very medieval. You have one advisor who has so much control over your life. The levels of specialization are not good for teaching humanities, not good for analogies. And then we have godlike technology, which, again, our brains are not wired to be able to deal with this, especially in a thoughtful way. Okay. So since 1950, when colonized nations gained independence, they became engaged in the global economy. They start developing a higher percentage of the world output, and now they're creating more of the world's products. So the US is being replaced, which is not a big deal. 1978, Deng Xiaoping opened up China to capitalism. There was a huge rise in the overall global economy. China has had 10% growth for nearly 35 years. Now that is a lot. That means your economy doubles every 7 years. So now it's 32 times higher than it was. It's the largest world economy. It surpassed the USA in 2013. And recently, its growth rate is 6%, the USA is 3%. And over time, that makes a big difference. So, it's nothing to be afraid of. As long as Americans flourish, there's no need to have to be better than somebody else. The problem is inequality within our country. All right, what are the challenges? Well, destabilizing. Okay, one of the big challenges is economic inequality, both between countries and within a countries. So we definitely need better redistribution of wealth. And hopefully Americans have caught on to this, although I'm not sure, but it really is important. The environmental crisis is important, and war, avoiding war. There is this problem with low-skilled workers versus high-skilled workers, the need for workers to get the right education, the need to have tax the wealthy to provide these programs so that the lower class can have a livable life and the skills necessary to get the jobs necessary to have a livable life. Challenge of planetary boundaries are all the environmental issues, precision agriculture, changing building design, how buildings are built. I've been to energy fairs where it shows all the aspects of building. It isn't just the architecture, like whether it's built to face the sun in the south, but also the materials used to build it. There's just many, many layers. And again, a lot of that is new. And so we have to change that. We have to change our diet. Okay. So we need biospheric integrity. We are disrupting these biospheres and these regional systems, biological systems. Our fresh water use is out of control. Our biogeochemical flows, ocean acidification, that has to end. And the microplastics in the ocean are getting into our brains. Ozone depletion. It's just chemical pollutants. This is what I say, that you can have research that might possibly prevent cancer, but in the meantime, all of these things keep going on. This seems to be more important to stop it before you do it, rather than someone makes money continuing it, people get sick, and then you try to get research that might help. By the time you've established anything, another disease has developed, or a resilient variant. Okay, we need it now. The risk of conflict, USA versus China. This is from the book Thucydides, and this is relevant to the lecture on Athens, is that both Thucydides and Plato lived during the same time. And Thucydides was a general, and he watched Athens destroy itself and turn into an empire and then fail, lose the war. And so he wrote a book, and he said at the beginning, I want people to learn from my book, because he figured this would happen again and again. There's a dominant power and there's a rising power, and they end up going to war. Now, the problem now is I have seen a number of prominent people in prominent think tanks, who get paid a lot of money, they got a lot of status, to advise us about the Carnegie organization dedicated to peace, and all they say is, oh, well, it's this Thucydides trap. We're going to go to war. It's like, no, the whole point of Thucydides was, don't do that. It's a catharsis. Flush that out of your system. Look at all the harm it does. So they're doing exactly what the Athenians did when they didn't understand their poetic tradition anymore. They were using Homer to justify, or going to the tragedies to justify their irrational behavior, instead of flushing it out, getting over it, becoming more critical thinkers, avoiding mistakes. No. And we're doing exactly the same thing. It's very shocking. So I thought, geez, who am I? I'm a humble teacher in a small school. I need to listen to these hotshots. Well, when they say things like that, you don't need to listen to them. I keep trying, but wow, I'm disappointed. I think when it comes to the interview process, the institution wants a perspective. They don't want an open mind. They don't want someone to keep abreast of things and keep avoiding making mistakes as things change. They want someone with an agenda, their agenda. So once you get that job, you can't really have an open mind. So that's the advantage of living, teaching in a little school. Just like Socrates was a stonecutter, he had the advantage. He didn't have to represent the military or the political class or anything. He could just ask questions and examine himself and the leaders. And if they were wrong, they're wrong. So sustainable development has really stalled. So even 200, 250 years ago, the Enlightenment thinkers like Nicolas de Condorcet, he believed in the perfectibility of human beings. He believed science was going to save us. And he knew eventually that we couldn't exploit nature forever. And eventually we'd have to control population. But he thought science will have made people's lives so much better that when the scientists tell them you have to control population or whatever else the scientists tell them, they will do it because they know that, hey, we know the advantages. We know that science gave us everything. And so if these are what the scientists are saying, we better do it. No, de Condorcet got that wrong. He didn't know the power of fear, the power of political rhetoric, the power of religious rhetoric. And people would actually go against science. So that's what's been happening because people are addicted to fossil fuels and they have plenty of corporations, politicians that pander to their addictions and tell them they can just go on living the way they are living. So what happened, 1987, there start to be these organizations that are calling it out, although it really is a lot later. I knew this in 68, and I didn't grow up in a fancy place, went to a public school in a kind of remote flyover country, but you could know this. Then the UN Conference on Environment, 92, it was ignored. Then 2012, Second Earth Summit, and develops the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's what Jeffrey Sachs, his work has been, working with other people. Aristotle's virtues are sort of the backdrop for Sustainable Development Goals. And so we will cover that later on in the class. But the goals are to end extreme poverty, to end hunger, ensure universal health coverage, education, access to safe water, electricity, decent jobs, modern infrastructure, gender equality, reduced inequality of income, reduced inequality, peaceful and lawful and inclusive societies, sustainable cities, sustainable production and consumption, control of climate change, protection of marine ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystems, global partnerships. Okay, so it's not utopian, right? It's a goal. You can't get anywhere if you don't know where you're going. It's a goal. And also, the book points out the income inequality is so extreme that even with any kind of reasonable distribution of income, these goals we could be much, much closer. For example, if the top 1,700 richest people in the world gave 1% of their wealth, every child alive could be in school, which, that's not utopia to say that. That's survival. If you don't educate your children, and globally, these children will grow up to be terrorists, they will take suggestions from people who can wrap them around their finger to do anything, because they don't have hope. And these terrorists, radicals, people who prefer violence, will have a whole army of young kids working for them because they didn't have any other option. So it's not utopia to put kids in school and to tell them they have reasons to hope for a better life and a decent job, not sophisticated, but decent job and income. We have to look to the future systematically and rationally, planning, updating, adapting, multi-dimensional systems thinking. Okay, you have to have integrated approaches, interchange of ideas, so that the disciplines, right? Science, social science, humanities, they really have to work together. All the STEM disciplines, everyone has to be working together. And that's phronesis. That's what he is. Jeffrey Sachs uses Aristotle as sort of his backbone, but updates it to the UN SDGs. There are environment, social, and governance investments. There are lists of those investments, lists of companies that are committed to those. The social, okay, so the highest quality of life is in Northern Europe, and that's called social democracy. So the ethos, the culture of social democracy, is a good model to look at and try to follow. They have the lowest fossil fuel emissions, the highest life satisfaction, good governance, social ethos, social democracies, a set of ideas for organizing politics and the economy, private ownership plus worker unions, labor rights, healthy work-life balance, family leave, vacation time, universal public services, universal healthcare and education. So it's the middle way. The US has way too few taxes and too few social services and huge income inequality. The developing countries can also have a privileged class, or they don't have enough money to provide for basic middle class universal public services. Another point he makes is as we do this, we have to have the principle of subsidiary, which means private goods. Okay, there's certain things that households spend their income on, and then there's public goods, education, healthcare, research and development, access to new technologies, protect the environment. So public versus private, and also public goods, some public goods are local, like schools, clinics, police, and roads. Some are national, like defense and highway system. Some are transnational or regional, river flows, environmental issues, navigation rights. Some are continental, pollution, biodiversity. So a growing number of the real big issues are more and more global. Public goods should be managed at the lowest scale of government feasible so that you have oversight and you know if you have accountability, transparency, you can know if your people are actually getting these services, education, healthcare, and police protection. China has a large-scale transnational cooperation and infrastructure. So they're really doing a lot of stuff that needs done, the Belt and Road Initiative and the global energy interconnection. So they are building the Belt and Roads. Some of those are built so that they can get coal from these countries, but they have a plan for peak coal when they want to become sustainable. Is I think their goal was 2035. They had a certain goal, and they've already cut back, and they're going to meet that goal sooner. And they're really working toward achieving these goals. And then they can export their solar panels and all the sustainable development products that right now the government is giving private sector companies research and development money to keep developing new products. So we've got so many layers. We've got to find an alternative to plastics. We have to find ways to get microplastics. I mean, there's lots of stuff. And so China is investing in that, and then they're going to sell those things. They built the Belts and Roads. So I hope America starts waking up and changing. I really don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. Right now, we are dragging our feet. We don't want to change. Fossil fuels forever worked for us, but my students definitely need to know that they should be part of the change. They should be right up there advocating for change. And there will be 8 regional groups. So, the ways Americans divide themselves, like the South versus the North, or, the Northeast versus whatever. It's just silly. We've got to think much more globally and then regionally. And if we want to have a future, if we want to have our place in the geopolitical balance of power, I don't know what we're going to do, but the next 10 years will be really critical. And my students just need to know that. Okay, so I think that's it for this lecture. And the reading assignment is, okay, I could try to find the specific pages that I assigned. Let's see, I assigned, there's 2 30-page excerpts. So one is at the beginning. Okay, we started at the beginning. And preface. Preface to one. So here are the pages. Here are just an example of the table of contents. And then the preface. I've talked about this in the outline, but I'll show you a few of the charts that he uses. So it's really the preface to mostly the first chapter, then acceleration of change. He has a chart of all the different eras, how much has accelerated. Here are some maps, that sort of, there's the world population, what it has been and what it is now and how fast it's accelerating. That's the main point. And here's another point, the rate of urbanization, once again, it's huge. It's just changing so rapidly. Then the output per person has changed incredibly, right? We've become way more efficient. Let's see. employment, okay, in the different sectors. Remember, the primary was agriculture, secondary, and then the tertiary was the services. So again, it was mostly agriculture and secondary, and then the third level has always been the least, and all of a sudden now it's the most. The industrial went up, it's about even with this, with the manufacturing, but then now, so this is another important thing to keep in mind moving forward. Um, okay, the way of understanding that, little charts, favorable. So I did skip from page 20 to 28, and then we went to page 31. So I think that's the preface and the first chapter up to page 31. And then the second reading was, whoops, I have to, uh, back. Digital age. Mhm. Um, all right, so then the second reading is the digital age, chapter 8. And here's the number of people who live below $1.90 a day, and the share of people who live that, right? The percentage. It's going down, right? People are becoming wealthier. I know that it sounds terrible, but when I was in Indonesia, $2 a day is not nearly enough. But there were people in the villages. They inherited their house, didn't have any payments on house. They, I don't think they had transportation cars, but they had fruits and vegetables just grew on trees outside or the gardens. So there was just a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables. There were chickens roaming around, and there were fish. Every family had a fish pond. Um, so you could get fed and you could get pretty healthy food, actually. And they had, their farms. Didn't have to be that big to have a healthy diet, actually. Um, but, there's all the other things that we need besides that. It's just, that doesn't necessarily mean you're starving. Um, the growth rate of GDP per capita is pretty amazing. And it's rising. And then the trading places, okay, global output by the advanced countries versus the developing. So from the year 2000, this is pretty amazing. So the advanced countries went from 58 down to 40, and the developing countries went from like 43 up to almost 60. So no problem. I mean, it's nothing to be afraid of. I think it's great. I'm celebrating it because uh, more equality as far as I'm concerned. We're moving toward more prosperity for everyone. The Chinese and the US share of world output. So the US was way ahead in 1980, and then about 2012, China replaced them, which again, China has 4 times as many people, so shouldn't be any problem there. It's exciting, like, yay, their people can have a good life. Then there's the research and development as a share of GDP. This is really important because this is how you move forward, right? Is if you're doing research and development. So let's see, I think China is the one rising, and we're, I think, I can't tell by the colors, but China's on the rise, and that's fine. They're doing a green development too, which is what makes me happy because we have research and development, but it's still fossil fuel. It's too much related to the fossil fuels, I'm sorry. And then here's another one where I think the US is going down and China's coming up. And that's exciting. I think it's exciting because they are going green. So the Chinese know. Mr. Xi delivered his State of the Country address. And it's just green technology is the way they understand their future. That's all. It's just a given. We are still fighting, which unbelievable to me. The Europeans have done a lot with green energy. It's just that they don't have the resources that China has. They're starting to work with China, some of the countries. All right, so here are the issues and the relative threats. So, what's safe, what's uncertain, and what's high risk? Genetic diversity, biosphere integrity, climate change, novel entities, stratospheric ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosol loading, and geochemical flows, nitrogen, phosphorus. So all of these things are issues, and they're becoming bigger and bigger issues too. Yeah, there's smog, there's algae. Yeah, what's going to be submerged if we have a 6-meter sea level rise? There's so many cities that are on the coast, right? Because of shipping. And here's chapter 9. So it was chapters 8 and 9. There are the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't think I'll read them. You can look them up, but that's what he's aiming for. And guiding globalization. Oh yeah, fertility issues, that's important. And that's it. We end on page 205. So that's the end of this lecture. And I hope you buy the book. It's a good book. And I also advocate that people buy books. They don't just read online. They put the book up on the shelf. I have my books on shelves, and then I look at my books, and I can see the line of reasoning in each book. I can see how they relate to each other. And I have a map in my head for how I want to look at the world as I go about my daily life. And so I can see myself within this much broader context. And we do have the leisure time, and we do have the education. We're literate, we can read, but Americans aren't reading. And reading online does not affect your brain. It doesn't imprint itself in the back of your mind. So it's part of your worldview. It's something you carry around with you. And that affects how you make judgments day to day. For example, how many people, when they go to decide what to eat, think about the fossil fuel footprint of what they eat, where it comes from? How many people think about what it's made of? How many people think about how much pollution how much land was used, whether it's methane is. I mean, I've been thinking about this for decades, and it's not hard. Once you read some things, you imprint it in your mind, you make it a habit. It doesn't mean that I only buy local or anything, but I'm just aware of it. It's part of my worldview. That's what I would like my students. Just please develop a worldview where you have a lot of self-control because you see yourself within this broader context. It wouldn't occur to you to go destroying nature. I do not understand, for example, why students waste food. What is it that's going on in their head that Mother Nature is so generous that you can just exploit her for whatever food you want? You don't feel like eating it, just throw it away. Like nature doesn't exist for us, for our pleasure, satisfaction, and we can do whatever we want. It's just very offensive to me. It shows such a lack of respect. And lack of an understanding that you depend on Mother Nature, you know? You're not a god. And the more we exploit her using fossil fuels, we're gonna die. Like I just wish students would just understand. They didn't grow up with it. It's okay. Their parents got acculturated into this very abnormal society, toxic culture. So the toxic culture not only damages your physical and mental health, to me, the worst damage it does is it creates a very false view of the world and your place in it. Ultimately, your ideas determine what you put up with yourself when you behave, when you decide what choices to make. So please think about it. Try to use the 7 Ages of Globalization, the fourth industrial revolution, as the backdrop from which you make all of your decisions, right?